Th- This talk is on strategies for a beautiful garden and healthy habitat. And the Minneapolis Design Guide was developed for Wild Ones National to help people learn about using native plants in garden design. The approach or the big picture of this design, the Minneapolis one, is working with nature. Plants are selected to thrive in the site conditions, to be compatible with each other, and to support wildlife. Natural processes shape the garden, and good management guides the process. No doubt, everyone here is interested in less lawn and more habitat. And a small garden like this one, anchoring the corner of this yard, reads like a traditional garden, even though it's using native plants. You know, it's a collection of 4 plants: little blue stem, purple coneflower, and right off screen to the right, there's a northern pin oak and butterfly weed. But it could, it can easily be maintained with conventional practices like weeding and dividing plants if they grow out of bounds, and mulching to keep things looking tidy. But what happens when your appetite for less lawn and more habitat grows? When your lawn is reduced to mowed paths, or you have no lawn at all? How will you keep the garden from being overrun by invasive plants or from it becoming just too much work? The answer: the aesthetics, the habitat, and management, they all need to work together and with nature. And we do this so that we can create a pleasing experience for people, space for wildlife, and a manageable landscape. So let's take a look at the plan and the design strategies. Now, this is an overview of the plan. The actual design guide I put together has 6 pages to it, and you can download it from the Wild Ones National site. So this is the overview with all the detail taken off it. So what it is, this overview is a collection of individual gardens. Each one of these little areas is a different unique garden matching different kinds of site conditions. Each of the garden areas has been thought through considering the location and the potential needs of the garden area, the light, the soil, the moisture. I've also combined plants that will grow well together, filling different ecological niches and matching or attempting to match their competitive level. So a menu of garden ideas, and you should be able to look at this or the more detailed plan in the package and find something that matches your site. Maybe you have a shade tree and you're thinking that you could put a garden under there. So a woodland garden in shade of existing tree, or a woodland garden in loamy clay soils. Or maybe your site is sunny and it's well-drained sandy soil. So the situation for everything you can imagine. And then I've further broken it down then into detailed sheets, and I've broken it into sunny gardens and shady gardens, and then also a page on using trees and shrubs to layer the garden. So this one is about the prairie gardens. Plants thrive when they're in a location where they are well adapted, and matching site conditions is a key strategy to use to achieve a healthy plant community. And a signature, of course, of the prairie is that there's a lack of trees and there's full sun. We also need to consider soil type. Do you have sandy soil? If you do, it's porous and it's very well draining. Or maybe you have the tight structure of clay soil. It's very slow draining. You also think about the availability of the moisture. Is it, it's influenced by your topography, right? Are you at the top of a hill, or are you at the bottom of a hill? Are you, how close are you to the water table? Are you near a wetland, excuse me, or by, excuse me, or by a lakeshore. Other conditions like the availability of stormwater runoff, these are all types of things that you think of and are key to matching your plants to your site and having success. It's the right plant in the right place. Many plants are adaptable to growing in a wide range of conditions. These moisture-loving plants, the meadow blazing star, sneezeweed, New England aster, I have these growing in my yard at the bottom of a slope, and they're thriving. It's my yard's an experiment, and I learn about relationships. I have successes and I have failures. This is one that works really well as long as there's moisture. And being a plant that really likes it wet, I have times where I never irrigate my yard, so I have times when they really start to look a little tough. And but that's just a part of my management style. So it's really about right plant in the right place. And if you don't get it right, the plants move around, adapting to their environment. You know, much of my yard is like an oak savanna, open woods kind of condition with a scattering of trees, creating light shade and a few sunny areas, as you just saw. The sweet black-eyed Susan in this picture is better adapted to this light shade, while the sun-loving blazing star and the rattlesnake master that I used to have in this bed, they disappeared, outcompeted by better adapted plants. So it's something to think about when you're selecting plants. You may not get it right. There's this gradient of light and there's a gradient of moisture, but the plants work it out, and you can interact with it and do more work if you want. Prairie vegetation needs to be periodically removed. You know, if you're in a situation, you might be able to burn it, but in my urban lot, I cut it back and rake out the material. And this disturbance is needed to keep the prairie thriving, to prevent trees and shrubs from establishing, and it's all about that nutrient flow, and it's more than I really comprehend. I'm just beginning to really grasp this whole thing with nitrogen and how taking away the material will affect one kind of plant, and this whole thing about roots. I just know it needs to be done. Another consideration is cutting back fast growing plants. Like I have hyssop in here, and there's also wild bergamot. These both thrive in this condition, and they are also those early successional plants that can also, on the one hand, they're covering the ground, they're doing what you want it to do, but at the same time, they're taking up that space. You know, the plants are all competing for this light and moisture and the sun, space. And so if one gets away, it just starts to really fill out the space earlier than something else that takes more time, you might compromise the ability of those more conservative plants. So it's something that you just decide, you adapt to it and you decide. It's why I think of management as being just as important as the design. I just see it as a continuation of design on paper. Once it's in the ground, you're continuing to design forever, and it's just in a more maybe hands-on way. So creating more space for the less competitive plants, that's the point I was making with that hyssop. So another page I put together is about the woodland gardens. You know, these are gardens that you grow in the shade of a building or under trees and shrubs. Characteristic is that the leaves collect on the woodland floor. You leave it there as mulch to build the soil and retain moisture. And that is different than a prairie garden. Prairies, like I said, you have to remove that. You have to take it away in order to encourage the prairie plants to do their best. But it's the opposite in the woodland garden. You do want it to collect And the other thing, so that a new strategy, this would also apply to prairie, is that we want our plants to creep and intermingle and fill that space. And it's above ground and it's below ground. If the space is vacant, then you have a place for a plant to fill in. So it's just another strategy working with nature, that you let the plants, and as you, as the steward of the garden, you allow it to, you guide it and you adapt to what you're seeing, whether you like it, whether you want to do more maintenance, or whether you're just going to let it go and see what happens. This is another strategy, right? We're combining plants with similar competitive level. And in my yard again, and it's a successful garden. It's a successful match of competitive level. These plants are all seeming to hold their own against each other or with each other. It's changes from year to year, especially, as Ava said, with rabbits that love to graze in my gardens. They all seem to find their own little garden bed and do their thing. And first time last year, I had them, couldn't believe it. I was losing the geranium. They were disappearing. And it was those rabbits, but it all came back, just maybe a little bit differently. So combining plants with similar competitive level, and as you as the designer, or, and at this point, you're designing by managing the garden, and you decide whether it's working. I let the wild violets come in. There's oak fern, which came with my yard. It's just, there's a lot of natives, and I'm fairly close to the Mississippi. And I don't know if it's just that they've crept up from there, or because my yard is on this hill and it was just sort of left. It's many plants that just seem to find their way into my yard, which is fortunate. The more competitive plants in this planting are the Long Beach sedge, Carex springelii, and mayapple. They're just taller, and the mayapple has a root that spreads fast. The Long Beach sedge, once it establishes, it's pretty much, it's fairly conservative, staying as a clump, but it tosses the seed. And because it's bigger than Pennsylvania sedge, it can outcompete it. And the wild ginger, though it's shorter, it still has a pretty strong root and can really hold its space, as well as that geranium. One plant that's under here, this garden, like many of my gardens, have consumed many plants I put in with the hopes of sticking around, but have disappeared. And one that's still right in here, underneath here, is a maidenhair fern. So I'll have to decide what to do with that. I'll probably move it out of there. And the pagoda dogwood moved in on its own. This is a rain garden. The water comes comes down off the roof and under, and just sort of flows through here. Anyways, the point I'm making here is competitive level of plants. So here's a combination to think about combining plants in the size of your garden area. So this was probably a decade or more ago. And I put in early meadow rue, blue-eyed grass, which is a little tiny iris. There's the woodland phlox, and then there's dewy sedge. So I planted them, I thought what matched the conditions. It's very dry under the overhang, and I love sedges and want to try all the upland ones. So I put that in, and I thought, very traditionally thinking, I'll put these short stuff in front and I'll put the taller stuff behind. Well, look at the size of this bed. This bed is designed it's got enough room for one plant. Early meadow rue. And as I said, I'm not one who wants to do a lot of maintenance. I want to have it look good. I want it to fill. I don't want it to be full of weeds. So the aesthetics matter to me. And to me, this is just perfect. And I don't need the blue-eyed grass is gone. It's in there, but it doesn't grow. And I never see it. Somewhere along the line, I added Turk's cap lily, and that's a competitive relationship, because the plant, I put them in, they were tiny. They didn't see them for probably 3-4 years. They were so tiny. I got them at the revival sale, and they were probably first year seedlings. And eventually, 3-4 years after I put them in, they popped up and now they bloom and they get a lot taller than this actually, with their beautiful orange lilies. And the dewy sedge is hanging on. It holds its own because it so tolerates that dry soil back there. Seed dispersal and density of existing ground cover. That's a big piece about, getting your gardens to being able to be manageable and being something that you are happy with. And it's something I keep hearing from people as well. I don't want a plant that's too aggressive. Oh, I have such a problem with something, it just pops up everywhere. And oftentimes I hear it's the yellow coneflower, the Ratibida pinnata, or it's one of the goldenrod. The rigid is Solidago rigida, is that it? Stiff goldenrod. It's, for me, this is a very weedy native, and I love it though, the smooth penstemon. It's all over my lawn. I have as much of it in my lawn because the seeds just, it seems like wherever they land, they start growing. So the point here is you think about, well, okay, can I handle this amount of this kind of plant? And part of that, I'd say a big part of it has to do with how much bare soil you have. And the two are so tied together. So this is a brand new, well, the picture was taken when it was a brand new planted sort of pollinator pocket garden out at Wildflower at Lake Elmo. And it's a demonstration of some little all native plants. So hoary vervain and prairie dropseed. Prairie dropseed's a fairly conservative plant. You put it in the ground and it stays there. It does not throw its seed around. It just keeps expanding from, it's a bunch grass. It's not a tillering rhizomatic plant. It just, you plant it and there it stays. And hoary vervain will spread by seed. I think it's a perfect combination, but it's the kind of thing that you have to decide, okay, I have all this bare stuff. It's not the way you expect it to stay. You want these plants to grow together, and it works. So if you put in, sometimes it's like how soon you put a plant in. So that yellow coneflower, had I put in, 10 plants of yellow coneflower in here and just this one row of purple of prairie dropseed, I'd probably end up with an entire bed of yellow coneflower. So it's balancing, it's a balancing act. That's what it is. And the more this closes in, the less those plants that disperse by seed are able to disperse. And you can see this in the wild. This is in the boundary waters. It's disturbance, right? So again, it's a bare soil, just like this. Whoops, went the wrong way. This is disturbance. A brand new garden bed is disturbance. The trees, something blew down, and what happened? The big leaf aster just sprouted. It was probably in the seed bank, and now we have this beautiful carpet of the big leaf aster. And in a little while, I don't know how many years, when the trees that are growing in here, when they grow up, this will be reduced because it won't be as competitive. But right now, that's the plant that is most suited to the site condition. So the next few slides are all about that disturbance. So when I started, again, this is many years ago in my yard, I started immediately making woodland garden, an edge, a layered habitat. So I rake the leaves. I don't take leaves to the compost site. I just rake them in and I start a new garden bed. And when I started that here, the first thing that happened was things that were in the seed bank just started to grow. And the heartleaf aster was one of them. Up on top, up in that patio garden where you saw the sweet black-eyed Susan, and I mentioned I had blazing star and rattlesnake master growing in there. Well, that's this bed. And so this is from many years ago. And you can see I let the hyssop grow, an abundance of it. There was a lot of bare soil back then. And I loved it because it brought in the monarchs. I was probably really compromising my blazing star, but because eventually, like I said, they disappeared. So this is about layering and combining plants to lock out weeds. Now this is a completely different situation, but it has similarities. The problem being I had an invasive. So this is an alley garden, and I would always rake the leaves up and push them into this garden to clean the leaves off the alley. And I just had this abundance of creeping bellflower that was just getting into my region serviceberry. And I just, life's too short to keep wanting to dig it up. And, I found myself digging it up one more year, and it was like, what am I going to do? And I noticed it wasn't growing in the Virginia waterleaf. So I started taking the idea that I could just dig it out as well as I can. And then let's just start getting the plants in here that are more competitive, or at least equally as competitive, and layering it. So the Virginia waterleaf, Solomon seal was there, and I kept nurturing that. And Virginia creeper, which is just a native vine, everybody has it. Any kind of woodland edge condition has it. And that's what I created. I really pushed, I prune this, I clean it up. I keep it from growing into the serviceberry. I keep it from growing up the shade trees. And it's not much work, it's just occasionally. And the creeping bellflower has never come back, at least in this garden, which is a real success story, considering how much creeping bellflower pressure I have from the neighborhood and in my yard, and hard, it's hard to get rid of. So when you find a reason that you can use these kind of plants, can be so, they're so assertive, and people can feel like, it's not the kind of garden, it's not the plant like a Virginia waterleaf that you necessarily put in a bed of plants that are really conservative, that you don't want to have taken over, So, but they do have a place. They have a place where you want low maintenance. So the next part is about habitat. And I think probably everyone in this group knows a lot about it. Create continuous blooms from spring to fall, right? So in the woodland, we start with ephemerals and wild columbine a little bit later. And through that, I guess I'm really showing a combination here. These are more the woodland edge, open woods plants. So the hyssop, aster, so it's just spring to fall. And the Minnesota plan has that, or the Minneapolis plan has that considered. And when you look at those plant lists on the plan, you'll see that spring to fall bloom. And of course, we want pollinator plants, host plants, and there's, you can get, as Ava was mentioning earlier about some of the things, it's just, there's so many things to attract in that it would take, we could spend the whole night just talking about that. But to me, just this one plant, Golden Alexanders, I look at this and I see aesthetics, this pleasing experience, because I know this plant brings in this black swallowtail. And the first time I saw it and I found one, and it was so tiny, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was just a baby. And it was on one of my, Golden Alexanders. And that in itself is, a reason to garden right there. There's just the beauty of it. Wow. We just had an electric thing happen outside, this big boom. Anyways, the layered landscape is another page that I put together that details those plants using the understory trees and shrubs. So that's what this plan is. It's all about adding habitat and privacy using that layer between the shade trees. So the plan has an existing shade tree, but you can imagine this is exactly where I showed you the early bed of heartleaf aster in the very early days. This picture was taken maybe 4 years ago. So I've added a lot more since then. Elderberry, serviceberry, pagoda dogwood. That's that understory layer. And then of course there's the ground layer. And what this provides then is nesting, it provides shelter, and it provides food. It provides a succession of flower for pollinators and fruit throughout the year for birds and insects. So everyone knows the serviceberry is very early, right? It blooms, and chokecherry has just happened. Pagoda dogwood is blooming right now. And the same with the berry. So if you have variety, and you'll find that in the bird book that was mentioned, Ava mentioned earlier, that Wild Ones Minnesota chapters put together. There's so much information, good information in that book that tells you, that you can, this will be available as fruit to the birds soon. The pagoda will be much later in the summer. And then, of course, the ground layer that in the plan, it's designed, with sedges and grasses and perennials, and it's designed to adapt and fill the space as the understory matures and changes the light from sunny to shady, right? That's, unless you already have a shady condition, you have to sort of transition through that. And I think we probably pretty much covered that with the sweet black-eyed Susan. In this case, many of these things just came in, but the woodland poppy and the violet, these are things that can tolerate sun and shade, as well as the wild columbine. The zigzag can handle some sun, but thrives in the shade. And the large leaf, I planted these myself, thinking, oh, this plant's going to be so competitive, and it is just being suppressed by everything else. But that's okay. The point is I've got a good ground cover, and it's keeping out the weeds. Another point about habitat, and is just as well about management, is that we don't blow leaves out, right? We don't need to take the leaves out. It's just totally destructive that we leave these leaves, because it's, this is an example of management, habitat, and aesthetics working together in an ecological design. You leave the leaves to build the soil, to retain the moisture, to create habitat for birds to forage and insects to complete their life cycle. These plants, it's really hard to grow plants if you're blowing away what will support them, and as well as their seeds. And of course, it's just, you leave those seed heads standing through the winter. It's beautiful, it's habitat. And, if you have it situated so that you can see it right out your window, then you get to see the bird life as well that come to enjoy it. Now, another way to use the overall plan, and this is just the backyard of it, is to think about ways of how to use it to lay out space and create garden experience. So it's more than just these collections of plants thought out, but you can also study the whole plan and think about, well, how do I carve out space? How do I create a place to sit? If I have a deck, we were given this blank template that had a deck and just a bare yard and one existing tree. So what are you going to do next? You have nothing, and it's like, all right. For me, it's like, well, I want to be drawn out. What's going to carry me out into the backyard? What's the, I want a nice wide walkway, a patio, something that is just draws me out. And then all of a sudden I've created a stage to create a planting bed. And, I add a bird bath and some colorful flowers, and it just draws you out. Or maybe you add a tree to add privacy to your deck, or a place to sit way out. Put a path and way out into your yard and surround it with spring, summer, and fall blooming flowers, a place to sit. You add that understory of trees, or maybe if you have nothing, maybe you'll add overstory trees as well, and to create privacy around you. So my last set of slides are to talk about that organizing space and giving your gardens legibility so that they don't feel like chaos. I think a big part of it is just laying out the space and defining rooms. So how this space was developed was, it began with the goal of having a patio in the backyard accessible from a kitchen door that was way over here. But it was important to the client because the sun was back here. The backyard was here. They didn't want to be tucked away in the side yard, you know, against a blank wall, and the neighbor was right here. So, you know, brought a path out, put the patio out here, and then all of a sudden we've created this space for a garden. So what's going to happen here? That's, you know, that's the way we organize space. We think about, you know, the priority, and the priority in this case was defining and creating an outdoor room. And the client, one of them really wanted lawn, very conservative in terms of what, you know, how much planting there should be, how much garden bed. And I encouraged them and pushed them to try Pennsylvania sedge as the lawn. And it's so much more sustainable. This is, you know, irrigated yard. We turned off this zone. It's never been irrigated since the plants were established. And it has, plants were put in to screen the neighbor, native, they're actually cultivars, red wing viburnum. But the early meadow rue, and then there's a little waterway from the drainage coming off the rooftop. The swale goes like this right out to the alley, but it pretty much disappears. The water just gets used up by everything on the way. So the longbeak sedge, and there's great blue lobelia in here, and she keeps it blooming because her maintenance style is to, she wants to maintain it. She wants to keep them. And she knows to do that, that she needs to pull out anything that gets in there. So it's not a huge amount of maintenance. She just gets it done once a year. She remembers that she wants to have this well-articulated look. And I really love it. I think, you know, my tendency is to let things just go. And the fact that she's kept up the design this way, it's a once a year effort. There's a big river birch above this patio here. And in the spring, she pulls out any weed seed, tree seedlings that are in there. And this early meadow rue, if there's any that have moved, she'll pull those out. And then she'll clear out and make sure that there's nothing here. And that's it. And the sweet Joe Pieweed, we've continued it along here, saying that what we tried originally didn't really grow. Another idea about this organizing space and making it legible, this garden started by the path. It was all driven by the need for circulation to, you know, move from the patio and be able to come down and access a lower patio. And actually, this is above that rain garden that I showed you earlier. So the water drops down into this catchment and flows right underneath the path here. Just there's a PVC, 4-inch PVC pipe that's under here to make the water flow. Actually, I'm not sure if we put that pipe in or not. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's here, just as a backup to make sure that the water definitely has a place to flow through here. And so this bed is was started out as Pennsylvania sedge, and then the early meadow rue, a few moved in, and I decided that it was right, it looked right, that the design was really holding up, the legibility of it was because of this path. And you know, the path frames the woodland garden, or the woodland garden frames the path, which either way, the aesthetics is very pleasing to me. And I know the wildlife likes it. And in this case, the way that I organize and try to make this look legible for people is with this structure, with this wall. So the whole concept of this project was, it's very large. It's a conservation development that's called Wildflower at Lake Elmo. And the big idea was to carry prairie planting throughout the entire site, throughout the open spaces, throughout the conservation area itself is a seeded prairie. It's a very large area, 60 acres. And then there are the boulevards, and there are the large lot homes. And then there are these smaller garden villas that are just 60-foot wide lots. And there are 3 blocks of them, big blocks. And they're square, rectangular, and behind these houses are it's this one big square that, this sidewalk goes the whole way around, and there's a park in the center. Anyway, so what we ended up with is the front doors. The driveways are off the backside like an alley. And this little wall is the unifying element that goes around each one and around each one of these 3 blocks. So that now when, these are brand new homes and people come here, and what they experience is this kind of wild landscape. And yeah, there are cultivars mixed in. It's a pollinator garden. There's some, sedums and things. And but there are also a lot of native plants. So that's the aesthetic, is just trying to contrast that sort of more formal clean edge with the wildness of the prairie. So gardening with native plants takes a holistic approach. It's about designing relationships. We can create a beautiful experience while at the same time habitat for wildlife. It takes connecting the dots between our actions and the goals we want to achieve. These gardens, they look different because they are different. They're designed and managed in a way that conserves resources and functions as habitat. We can shape their wild nature to appeal to our aesthetics, yet at the same time, the more we understand them, the more we appreciate their wild beauty. I am all for less lawn and more wild, and I'm guessing that most people here tonight agree with me. But with that, I'm going to pass it back to our moderator and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Carmen. There are 2 questions that came through so far, and as I put in the chat, people are welcome to put questions in the chat or unmute too. But the first one is related to the leaves you were talking about. Tyler says he has a sunny spot that still manages to collect lots of leaves. The sun conditions make him plant more prairie plants, but he wonders what's being suppressed. He's worried about harming wildlife by moving leaves. If you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have gone through that too, about, because we know that leaving leaves are so important, and when do we move them? And I think one of the general things about if you feel the need to move them is the timing of it, and also not, I used to mulch leaves, right? And now when you listen, Heather Holm seems to be like such an authority with that no, you just pick it up and move it. So find a place where you can make a pile. If you want to get it, get started on something in the spring, and you need to, cut things back, but you feel the need to leave stuff for the insects, it's also an option to just cut it back and move it to a location. So like when we cut back prairie, think about, really large prairies, high acreage. They don't burn, if you had a huge prairie, you're not necessarily going to burn the whole thing in 1 year. And same with mowing, you can do it in a rotation so that you're not taking away all the habitat in one season. So that seasonal management is one way to still leave habitat. Did I answer that whole question? Or was there another piece?
Although Tyler, feel free to chime in if not. There is a second part he had too, and he was also wondering if you know of any full sun plants that might be more successful in pushing through leaf litter, and he mentions a few that work for him, including rattlesnake master, hyssop, and milkweed.
Yeah, well, I think they all can. I mean, I really think plants are fairly strong and can push through whatever. I'm always continually amazed by that, where you think, oh my God, I'm going to smother them and I need to give them space. But then they seem to find their way through. So I would imagine anything that's taller and more robust, anything taller will be able to get through that, than versus like pussy toes. Pussy toes are a plant that have really challenged me. And, that's where you have to match that condition where dry sand, a soil that's very well draining, sandy gravel, something that's really nutrient poor. So if you dump a lot of leaves on that, it's, I think the pussy toes will probably disappear. So that kind of contrasting, it's not maybe just about the height of the plant, but also the condition. So if it's a plant that prefers a nutrient poor soil and you dump a bunch of leaves on it, that seems like a mismatch. So thinking of a plant that likes a richer soil, those I would think would be more appropriate way to place where you can leave leaves.
Great, thank you. Anna says she's planted butterfly weed and columbine several times, but they always disappear. She says even scattering the seeds does not help. What are the ideal conditions for these plants? And she also makes a note that columbine is eaten by a fly maggot, but
disappointing. I know things just there's so many things that eat things. The wild columbine I have found definitely moves itself around. So the ones that I think maybe I saw, maybe showed a few in here, they're just sort of scattered here and there because I've never done a huge dense planting, though I have in client projects, and I go back occasionally and see them and wow, they're still there. But so the ideal location, ideal situation is definitely where those, where it's not buried in plants or buried in litter, where you have more of a sandy, more gravel versus like a heavy kind of condition where moisture is being retained. I think the columbines, the seed needs to be exposed. So if you're dumping, you're letting things build up or you have a lot of mulch, that columbine, that's not the place for it. So I know it's definitely an alkaline plant. People will find it end up, growing on the edges of their garden up against, the concrete or up against the foundation of their house. So more nutrient poor is probably a good spot for it.
great, thank you. From Eva, and I must have missed the context for this one because I'm not totally clear what she means, but she asked, what do you mean by legibility?
Legibility is really being able to read the landscape. And I think, as I said in my closing comment, the more you know about this kind of wildness, I think you see the beauty in it. So this picture I leave you with is like, some people would look at that and say, God, that looks like chaos, maybe, because these tall plants and they're right at the front door and all this kind of weedy, grassy stuff around. Well, for me, legibility, when I look at this, I read this as a really well-developed and well-understood landscape. And the one that I showed with the Pennsylvania sedge, which is more of a monoculture, that's something that a lot of people can read. There's very legible. People know when they see that one plant, they know what they're looking at, and it makes them comfortable, I think, for that reason. I think they see it as, wow, it just sinks in as understood, and the beauty comes through that way. Legibility comes from something like that early little garden I showed with purple coneflower. People see that and they immediately recognize it as, oh, that's a garden, I get it. They know it's a garden because they can read it. And that's what I mean by the word legibility.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another one here about leaves. Deborah says she rakes up leaves and wants to use them as mulch in a walking path, but they might blow away. Any ideas on how to keep them in place? Well,
definitely mowed leaves. So it's that balancing act between habitat versus mulch. But if you have a mulching mower, the minute you mow them, they just, at least it's my experience, because you saw the size of my yard is quite large. It's a double lot. And we have for years mowed up the leaves and then transported them over to the planting beds. And they never blow out of the planting bed because they're cut up. Water, of course, just wetting them down is another way.
Liz has a question about the children's playscape. She says she's intrigued by the design you mentioned and wondering if you're creating a garden that can withstand children. She says she's interested in plants that are a little sturdier to survive kids and dogs.
Yeah, well, that playscape is a daycare called Love to Grow On, and it's up in Lino Lakes. And it's planted with a lot of grasses. I have to say, you have to, just like with dogs, you have to fence things. Every time I've used, you know it from using little plugs too, probably. When you plant a new garden, it has to take time to establish. And you can imagine the pressure of kids in a daycare. They will destroy it unless the plants get a foothold. And the Playscape, their whole, it's been really great working with these guys because they have all these principles of design I could read through and what they were after. So they really want the kids to interact with nature, not just look at it. So to be able to make a path and cut through was important. So what I used, and of course Lino Lakes, I matched that condition, is, you put your shovel into Lino Lakes and you lift it out, and what you have is really sandy. I mean, it does not look like the soil in my garden. It's not loamy. It's a different color. It's a Yanoka sampling. So these shortgrass prairie type plants grow really well up there. So the grasses, little blue stem, the prairie drop seed, and the other grasses, the grama grass, forgetting its other name, you know what I'm talking about, the grama, the little critopendula and gracilis are, they're really tough. Those are actually sod forming. So they're even tougher than the bunch grasses, little blue stem and prairie drop seed, but those are pretty darn tough too if you get the roots growing. I mean, you think about the root structure, those plants have as much biomass underground as above ground. The longer they grow, everyone's heard that story of when people first came and they were able to cut, they ripped the prairie out. They were able to create sod blocks and build a house. They're very, very tough. So the plants that are more delicate, and I did add them into the garden, and they're going to have to just learn to not walk through them, are things like the butterfly weed, things like wild columbine and blazing star. So those are there, but it's more about, okay, you cannot just step on those because you're going to break them. So they're going to have to learn about that. Shrubbery, right? Shrubs are tougher, and shrubs that are not poisonous, of course, your list with a playscape, you have to make sure you're not adding stuff that has, that's poisonous. It's really, it's a big part of it. So viburnum and dogwood, red twig dogwood, those are really sturdy, tough plants unless they start climbing them. But the shrubbery, dwarf bush honeysuckle, those are all some of the more tough species that I use. So it's a pretty simple palette of plant material that I've listed. There's a lot of like switchgrass. Switchgrass is, you guys probably, Panicum virgatum is it's a big plant and it seeds profusely. And I often will just resort to using cultivars because, I can't let it just overrun things, especially if I'm not maintaining it. So I used a lot of that too, but that would be one. You could use switchgrass, would be an incredibly tough, as well as Indian grass. So I guess I'm listing grasses and shrubs as your dominant layer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just out of curiosity, would you include sedges with that?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Sedges, Pennsylvania sedge will never be as strong as a turf grass. And I guess that's all about, are you making a playscape for just a couple of kids or 80 kids? So it's a big difference. And it's also just like with dogs too, right? When I design for dogs, which I often do, I get called in because it's just, that's what you need. So what do dogs need? They need paths. They need clear paths, and they will follow the path. And kids will do it too. Kids will make their paths, and so will the dogs. So with dogs, a perimeter path going around the perimeter. And also with kids, just like dogs, it's the way you organize that space and make clear articulation between where they can go and where they can't go. Of course, kids will have a tendency to climb, but raised beds are really functional in a kid's environment as well as a dog environment. So you have that clear definition of, they're just going to take the dogs are, maybe not the kids, but the dogs are going to take the path that's, the easiest, path of least resistance. Sedges, the upland sedges, and, I guess if you want to, you saw that longbeak sedge is a pretty darn tough plant, and that would grow in an area that would be with more shade. So yeah, just research and look at, there's so many sedges and they would all be good, honestly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
From Tyler, he's wondering, when you're doing jobs for clients, do you plant or do you pack the plants closer together, go with more of a traditional spacing? He also says, obviously, some plants demand more space anyway. He says he sees benefits from both, but they also have their downsides. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm exactly my same thought, and I go through it with every project, the pros and cons, close and far. And, and I continue to read literature and see what other people have to say. And, plant dense, it's all a matter of how much maintenance you're willing to do in those first years, the first years of establishment, and how, whether or not you have a good management plan, whether it's built into your specifications so that it's going to happen. If it's a commercial project and you walk away, if it's, if the contractor isn't, if they haven't incorporated, if they have to be contracted to do it, to come out and do it. So it's sort of this range. So the tighter spacing is always safer. And what I've learned about that, so 18 inches on center, right, with the little plugs and even the bigger plants. And but then all of a sudden you go to this wider because maybe you're putting in number one, the larger container, number 3 container. They're going to fill in faster. And yeah, why spend the money then? 2 feet on center, even 3 feet on center, which is, some of these plants. But so then it goes back to what's going to be maintaining. So if this is my yard and I'm willing to take the time to keep that area in between clean of all this pressure that's going to happen, weeds you don't want, weeds you like the hyssop, or the bergamot, but it becomes a weed because all of a sudden it's like putting so much pressure on those plants you are trying to grow that there's no room for them. So it's a balancing act. You just have to decide. And so back to that literature that I've read, I always go back to reading Travis Beck's book, Ecological Garden Design, because he's done such a thoughtful, survey of the literature, and somehow he's connected with the Longwood, whatever that place is, Longwood Garden Center. It's like an arboretum. He has validated that, you plant close, and it is just totally an ecological thing that the plants are going to figure it out. There's always die off, whether you plant close or far apart, whether the plants have been thriving for a long time. It's just part of the landscape. It's part of a plant community to have plants die off. So don't sweat it is what I read from that. It's like, if you can afford it, put them close together. But then at the same time, make sure that the pressure on some doesn't overwhelm them.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. Although again, if people want to unmute themselves, you're more than welcome to do that as well.
I'm looking for the chat and can't even find it on my.
It's harder to find while you're still screen sharing. If you turn screen sharing, it'll be easier to see. There's a way to get to it from there, but it's a little trickier.
Yeah, I thought it was with participants, but I can see who's here.
Yeah, it's separate from that, but I'm not seeing anything else coming through. There are several thank yous for your answers. Oh, we had one. Uh, Tyler's wondering what can compete with Monarda on a north-facing slope with heavy soil.
Monarda fistulosa?
I just wrote Monarda in there. I would assume that, but I can't say for certain.
What can compete with Monarda fistulosa? Well, other tall, but you said north-facing slope. So you're saying it's in the shade?
He said it was, yeah, it says north-facing slope with heavy soil. He said it was a question from somewhere else in the chat, but I may have missed that one.
So there are some plants that I have found that, they're slow, but they eventually find their way up and out. These like, I'm thinking of the Baptisia alba, the Baptisias in general, the false indigos. Baptisia, it's just one as an example that I have been impressed with its ability to grow in lower light. I don't know about full shade, but definitely a low, part sun. And it's just sort of slow, and all of a sudden it just finds its way, even though there's all this pressure up above with other stuff. It eventually seems to make its way out. And then, of course, when it does, when it's spent all that time growing root and it gets above ground, it becomes tall and wide. The rigid goldenrod, right? It's a rosette. And but it gets so tall. So plants that have that capability of shooting up over it and being able, I think rigid should be able to handle a heavy soil. I mean, I think it likes a well-drained soil. Culver's root grows in a lower light, and Culver's root is one of those maybe slower to establish, but you can't knock it out. Eventually it finds the resources. It comes up and shoots up those wands of white, flowers on a stem, and is capable of managing that Monarda. Sometimes with that, Monarda fistulosa, it's just, and of course, all those tall, the big, the tall grass prairie plants, the big blue stem and the switchgrass, if you're willing to try that could compete. Big blue stem and Indian grass, plants that are just really big and robust. Little blue stem, I mean, what you're looking at in this picture is kind of a curious mess of little blue stem. And it did its thing earlier on, but that has never been suppressed by the well, this is not bergamot, but it would be similar, big plant. So the heavy soils and bergamot, I mean, that's the twist, is the heavy soil. So I would say Culver's root and the grasses would be a fun way to go.
Great. We had a couple more questions come through. Question about what will compete with golden Alexander in a rain garden with clay soil.
Oh, interesting. So, it's funny you say compete, because the golden Alexanders, it's easy to lose that plant with too much competition. But I know if you have a lot of bare soil, and it's definitely a seed dispersing plant. So is the rain garden in the sun or the shade?
I don't have anything. Oh, Deborah, did you want to say anything about whether it's in the sun or shade? You're welcome to unmute too, if that's easier.
Yeah, it's in the sun.
So golden Alexanders, and something that compete with it. So what's it doing right now? Is it just heavily seeding all over? Have you got a ton of it?
Yeah, it's starting to take over the rain garden.
I've
I've got turtle heads in there, and I have Monarda in there, and I just plopped a button bush in there, and they're doing okay. And then I made the mistake of putting obedient plant in there.
Well, Culver's root, we'll go back to that one. That would definitely be a plant that could handle it. Sometimes you have to, just rip some of that, something out that's gotten to be, if you just have too much of it and you want more diversity, you do have to remove it. And it's so easy to suppress that plant, in my opinion, just because the seeds get covered and it starts to get shaded out. And so when the button bush gets established, you're going to end up with more button bush and less golden Alexanders. But I like your combination, and the obedient flower. It'll be interesting to see where that goes.
I'm gonna dig it up.
Oh, and of course you can do sedges with it.
I put some in a pot. I put some obedient plant in a pot, and then I'm trying to weed the rest of it out. So I might just grow the obedient plant in pots.
Because I'm always pushing the limit, and I don't know where it was wasn't this yard, but a different place years ago. I had obedient plant and I put it in my upland garden, very dry. And I was so scared that it was going to take over, and it never did. It was just because it never got enough moisture. So well, I think the sedges, Deborah, add sedges. Not only you said full sun, so like fox sedge, or you could try gray sedge. What's that? Burr sedge? Carex grayi.
Okay.
They're tough and they're bigger, right? They're taller sedges.
Uh-huh.
I think that would compete.
Okay. I'll give that a shot. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. One more here. Donna was wondering if you have any recommendations to keep turf grass out of native gardens.
Oh, yes, I do. I'd say of all the yards, I visit a lot of yards, and in my own yard, if you're willing to do the cut edge, you have one of those half moon tools. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a spade is kind of rounded, but a half moon is a kind of gardening tool that looks just like a half moon. And I don't know what they're probably called an edger. And you just step on it, and you can do it with a spade or, a trenching, a ditch, whatever you call those kind of spades, but just pick up a half moon spade, a half moon edger. And you step down, you rock it, and you lift up and you push the dirt. And you just keep doing that around the whole edge. So you've created a little trough along your garden, and you have just officially severed the roots. And I find that even though you have to do it every year or maybe every other year, depending on, how neat and tidy you really want it to be, I found that to be really successful. Clients who do it, I'm always impressed. So I've started doing it in some of my gardens. Those edgers, metal edger, poly edgers, they sort of do it, but you know how our plants, they grow over, and then all of a sudden they're killing the lawn on the other side. So that can be a challenge. Unless you're really going to keep your garden within those bounds, that's a challenge. A wider edger like stone, right? I do a lot of those. But of course, where it butts together, that's always a little bit of an issue. So there are edgers. I call out these, it's a Deep Root is a product that's a brand, but it's essentially was designed to keep really invasive plants like bamboo out of just growing beyond its bounds. So you can't really get it under. So this would be a serious situation, probably more than just lawn grass. Like maybe your neighbor's creeping bellflower or something you're trying to keep out of your yard. You dig a trench and you bury that just like an edger, but it's 18 inches deep. And you can keep it raised up a little bit. And that is a tremendous barrier of keeping plants inbound or out of bound, out of your garden. But for a simple garden, for a simple edge, that trenching is, I think, a really successful way.
Another maybe challenging control question, creeping Charlie.
In lawn or in garden beds?
Doesn't say. Anna, do you want to chime in on that?
Garden bed.
That seems easier than lawn. I never had a creeping Charlie problem. And then, disturbance, right? I had to take down a crabapple that was in my yard. It had died. And who knows why, but all of a sudden Creeping Charlie appeared. Somehow it was there. And now I have it. And in my thin lawn, it's just traveled everywhere. And so now I am learning to experiment and how on earth do you control this stuff. And I have found it way easier to keep out of the garden bed than the lawn. It gets just built into that. You know, the best time to weed, this is my weeding management note, is after it's rained, but not immediately after, when the ground is really mushy, but you know, just wet enough that you're not in a really dry. So if you've had a week of no rain and the ground is just hard, if you try to weed anything out at that point, it's going to break. So it's about the timing. So wait till you've had some moisture in the ground, and then you're going to, obviously with Creeping Charlie, you've got to get under there and lift it and meticulously kind of pull it back. I think it's easier to do when you don't see, you know, cutting back when all the plants are gone and you can kind of see where it is an easy time. But probably the moisture is one of the most important pieces of that don't try to do it when your garden is, you know, baked dry. Do it when it's just moister, but not so moist that it compacts.
Great. I don't see any other questions. So unless someone has some major pressing questions, maybe we could wrap up. Eva, did you have anything you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say thank you to Carmen for joining us tonight. It's a wonderful presentation, fantastic way to spend a rainy evening preparing for the charge against weeds and planting our new plants. And thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. It's so wonderful to see your faces, and pretty soon we're going to be together in person. That's going to be terrific too. Anything else, Eric? Did I forget anything?
I think that is it.
Okay, remember to pick up your plants, look at the schedule. We look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you so much, Carmen.
Yep, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Have a good night, everyone. Take